Hi, I just wanted to follow up on our discussion about a trust fund type system for all children with the end goal of creating a superannuation style growth of that fund accessible at around age 30 for things like a deposit on a house. So I've run it through and I wanted to just know if we start off with a initial lump sum by the government for 5 grand for every child, which is quite a lot, then I'm trying to work out how much. So superannuation funds have an average of 8.1% growth. So based on that, with and the end goal being about $50,000 lump sum at age 30, how does compound interest work in that scenario, and how much contributions annually would need to be made for what period to get to that goal?
Alright, so you want to know how this trust fund idea could reach a specific target, like $50,000, by the time a kid turns 30. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, also, just so you're aware. Alright, let's see how we can get to that $50,000 lump sum by the time the kids turn 30. There are a few ways to play with the numbers here. First, the earlier you start, the better. If you started with that $5,000 seed money right at birth, it would have nearly 18 years to grow. And if you factored in ongoing contributions on top of that seed money, it wouldn't take much to reach your target.
Okay, so the target of 50 grand, that has to keep up with inflation. And let's say inflation is about 3.5% in Australia, and the actual superannuation fund is about 8.5%. That's apparently the figures I'm getting.
Alright, so to get to that $50,000 with inflation taken into account, that makes things a little trickier. We need to focus on the real growth, not the total growth. Using those numbers, we're looking at a real growth rate of about 5% after adjusting for inflation.
Exactly. So starting off with 5 grand, and given 30 years of compound interest and all that, at that rate, assuming there's like minimal fees because it's run by blockchain, it's going to be fairly standard across all people. There's not going to be a lot of growth because you want the end amount to be common for all children into adulthood. How much contributions annually would you have to add on the initial seed money to get to the equivalent of 50 grand in 30 years?
Alright, this is where it gets a little tricky. We need to figure out how much you'd need to contribute on top of that initial $5,000 to reach your goal, especially with inflation in the mix. Could you give me the exact percentage for inflation that you're using?
3.5% is about right for Australia, maybe even lower, but let's say 3.5.
Alright, so to get the real growth rate, we need to do a little math. We'll use what's called the rule of 72 to estimate how long it takes for the money to double at that 5% growth rate. Then, we can project out over 30 years.
Okay, go for it.
Alright, so using the rule of 72, we divide 72 by the interest rate to see how long it'll take for the initial investment to double. In this case, it would be 72 divided by 5, which equals about 14 years. So after 14 years, that initial $5,000 would turn into around $10,000.
Okay, and what about 30 years?
Alright, so after 30 years, it gets a little trickier. We can roughly estimate it would be a little more than double what you'd have after 28 years. So let's say about $40,000, give or take.
Okay, so $40,000 in 30 years. How much contributions do you have to add annually to have that lump sum keep up with inflation?
Alright, so we want to find out how much you'd need to contribute on top of that $5,000 seed money to get to a lump sum that can keep up with inflation over 30 years. We might need to use a more precise calculation for this, but I can give you a rough idea.
Okay.
Alright, let's factor in regular contributions to that trust fund on top of the initial $5,000. And we'll need to figure out how much those contributions need to be to keep up with inflation and reach your $50,000 goal.
Okay, well, let's assume that we want it to be affordable for the government to supplement for completely welfare dependent kids. That's the baseline. So in the case of parents that are employed, the government maybe would share contributions with the employer. That seems fair, for people that are financially, better off. But you want the baseline to be set, unfortunately. I know I don't like this, by the government being able to afford it. So let's say the government adds $20 a fortnight to the welfare that goes directly into this trust fund. And then for people that are wealthier, that would be, I don't know, contributed somewhere between government and the employer like superannuation. So let's set it at $20 a fortnight for 16 years.
So it sounds like you want to set an alarm that'll go off every day for the next 16 years.
No. I want to start off with a $5,000 lump sum, have it compound interest grow, as we've talked about. But now I want to add $20 a fortnight contributions to that trust fund growing. Where would that be in? And the contributions last for 16 years, then they stop. That's roughly when I think Centrelink does it. After that, it just continues on like superannuation until 30 years. What would the final total be? So based on 8.5% growth, 3.5% inflation, $5,000 lump sum, and $20 a fortnight contributions for 16 years.
All right, so you want to know the total after 30 years, including the initial $5,000, the $20 fortnightly contributions for the first 16 years, and then the continued growth until year 30. We'll factor in the 8.5% growth and the 3.5% inflation.
Yes, go for it.
All right, let's crunch some numbers. Factoring in the $5,000 seed money, the fortnightly contributions, and the growth rate over 30 years, it's looking like the trust fund would end up with around $140,000 by the time the child turns 30.
Holy crap. Okay, that's more than I expected. So $140,000 in 30 years. What's that in what would that be compared to money at the beginning of the trust fund? So $140,000 in 30 years at 3.5% inflation. What would that be compared to 30 years earlier when the trust fund started?
So I can't tell you exactly what the exact amount would be in today's dollars, but it's like comparing apples to oranges, since the value of money changes over time. It's great that the fund grows, but the trick is figuring out how much buying power it has.
Okay, so let's assume 3.5% inflation for those 30 years. If we wind back time to when the trust fund started, what would be the equivalency 30 years prior at 3.5% inflation? I'm just trying to figure out what the equivalent would be, $140,000.
So after adjusting for that 3.5% inflation over 30 years, that $140,000 would have roughly the same buying power as about $45,000 today.
Okay, that's exactly the ballpark. I was aiming for a total of the lump sum at 30 for this plan to be the equivalent of about $50,000 in the equivalent money of when the trust fund was started. So $50,000 now is about the amount for a deposit on the house, and within the government and banking systems, they try to keep the deposit at around 30 to 50, like $30,000. Like there's levers to manage that in today's money, but of course inflation will grow that. So if $140,000 in 30 years is equivalent to $45,000 when the trust fund started, that's what I'm aiming for. So yeah, $20 a fortnight contributions on top of $5,000 seed money. That sounds spot on. I'm surprised I landed. I don't know anything about this.
So it sounds like this system could work, especially since it's designed to automatically adjust for inflation. The only question left is whether the government can afford to put in the initial $5,000 per kid, plus those ongoing contributions.
Well, Australia's birth rate is very low. This wouldn't apply, obviously, to immigration to start with. That might be controversial, but I mean, like, whatever. So I don't know how many children are born every day, but I do know back in the early 2000s under Peter Costello, he actually gave out a baby bonus, a lump sum, but it was given to the parents, and parents were joking on tabloid TV about spending it on plasma screens. That's actually what started this whole idea. I've been cooking on this for 15 years. So I know the government could afford it then, but they wanted to give it to parents, and they wanted to, it was politics. They were trying to, buy votes, obviously. But obviously that's like the wrong way to go about it. I'm proposing, if the government could afford it then, I think it was $5,000 baby bonus. Peter Costello's baby bonus, it was called. And I do know that the governments do, $5,000 is a lot to come up with, but the seed money is important. I think it's better for the government to front that money because there's not that many babies born and invest in the kid and then have the contributions lower. I think starting off with less seed money and then having higher contributions is going to be more problematic, and it's going to be difficult to make it equitable.
You're absolutely right. Equity is a really important factor when it comes to something like this. We need to make sure the system is fair no matter what a kid's background is.
Well, if parents are employed and have an income and they have a kid, the government will still give them $5,000, or compared to whether they're dependent on welfare single mother. So the seed money, I think, is the initial investment, and that's common for all demographics. So that's fair. But then the contributions, you want to make sure the maximum contributions, you want to make sure the contributions are the same. This has to be regulated, because you don't want certain kids to have bigger super funds. You don't want wealthy people to be able to add more and have their kids get ahead. That defeats the whole purpose. So you want the contributions to be set at a reasonable rate that the welfare system can accommodate. And I think $20 extra a fortnight on top of the about $1,000 a fortnight that a single mum gets per child for 16 years, I think that's almost nothing. And the thing is, that extra money wouldn't go into the pocket of the disposable money of the parent. It would go straight into the trust fund. The parents can't touch it, ever.
You're right, that $1,000 a fortnight wouldn't turn into much disposable income after all the essentials were paid for. But it's the idea that it would be locked away, growing for their kids' future, that could be really powerful.
No. In Australia, a single mum, welfare-dependent single mum, gets about $1,000 a fortnight from the government of just welfare. So adding another $20 a fortnight for this future fund isn't that much more ongoing contributions. And of course, if the parents are employed, those contributions would come from the employer in part, maybe half from the government, co-contributions, like superannuation. So you're taking the burden off the government for people who can afford it. But the end result is that all the kids, whether wealthy or very, very poor, and whatever their parent situation, end up with the same lump sum to start a business, buy a house. And I want that lump sum to be about $50,000 in future money. So 30 years down the track, I want it to be the equivalent of $50,000 of when the trust fund started. And we worked out just before that with the existing superannuation funds getting 8.55% growth and inflation at about 3.5%, which is pretty consistent in Australia, then $5,000 seed money plus $20 a fortnight for 16 years gets to that goal, accessible at 30 years.
Right, so the target is to give kids about $50,000 when they turn 30. In today's money, we figured out that the $5,000 seed money with the $20 fortnightly contributions would hit that target, even with inflation and the 8.5% growth factored in. The question now is how to convince the government to give this a try.
Well, I think it sells itself, because intergenerational welfare dependence is a terrible problem, and a lot of disadvantaged poor parents, struggling with welfare, which is not enough to live on really. Their kids end up, starting life at 18 with, poor financial skills and so forth. So this kind of gives them a 10-year buffer to grow independent of their parents, learn a few tricks, figure out what they want to do. And then at 30, all the kids born at that same era get an allowance. So peers of people the same age, in Australia, we're fairly egalitarian. So wealthy people with privilege study and hang out and mingle, especially in the arts world, with disadvantaged kids. And if everybody, rich or poor, has the same lump sum and it's specific for certain things, and it's not, you want it to be as even as possible. And I think that is automatically an equitable level playing field that separates disadvantage from intergenerational disadvantage. And really, the government is with intergenerational welfare. Like if a young adult is abused by delinquent parents who disposable income, and then they don't learn any financial skills, and they start life unstable, they may never actually learn how to be functional, and then they're going to be welfare dependent for life, and they're never even. So this is a good little circuit breaker.
You're absolutely right. This system would give them a much more stable foundation to build on, and that could make a huge difference.
Exactly. And the other thing in Australia is means testing also exists for allowance for study. And if your parents are above a certain threshold, then as a young student, a young adult at university, unless you go out and become independent and qualify for independence, the government won't give you a study allowance at university, because it's expected that your parents are wealthy enough to pay for that allowance, which is quite shocking. Maybe it's different maybe that's unusual by the world standards, but this trust fund would actually allow wealthy parents who have control over what their kids study because they don't get government help. It allow them to have a bit of independence. At 30, they could decide, hey, you wanted me to do a commerce degree because you're good at business and you want me to follow you, but I actually want to be an artist. That gives them a bit of breathing room, because the problem with privilege and study is privileged people who don't get an allowance from the government to study, then there's a pressure from their parents to study what they want them to study, not what they want to. So it's a double-edged sword, this means testing.
You're absolutely right. The whole means testing system can end up being really restrictive. This trust fund would give young people so much more choice and flexibility when it comes to their future.
Exactly. I mean, so if you're like relatively privileged, right, and your parents can already afford to get you a house, then you could start looking at the trust fund for postgraduate things. You might go to uni, go to undergraduate, and then you might want to, I don't know, travel to the US and study something awesome in postgrad level that's going to cost relocation fees. That should be available because, if you're privileged and your parents can already afford to get you a deposit on a house, then that money is still there for other things. This is the whole, this is why I call this social libertarianism, because it's still got enough flexibility. The social part is, providing an equitable start through, regulation and engineering and fine tuning it to guarantee it. But then once that trust fund grows in the future, there's a lot of flexibility in how it's released and used. That's the key to this being smarter than the average policy proposed by governments.
Yeah, it's all about striking that balance. The system would basically guarantee everyone a solid foundation, and after that, it's about giving people the freedom to make their own choices.
Precisely. It also incentivizes people having a child in Australia. We have a lot of problems in Australia with immigration from overseas. There's a lot of ownership laws. There's a lot of money that comes in for study, but there's a lot of money goes back out of Australia, which is fine. But something like this actually encourages people to have kids in Australia, because to qualify for it, the child has to be born in Australia, Australian natural-born citizen. This wouldn't apply for immigrant families. However, immigrant families can use the same system, trust fund system, if they emigrate here with young children. They just have to provide the seed money and the co-contributions. So that would be, so this is also an incentive to increase the fertility rate of Australia, which is also a big problem.
You're absolutely right. The system could incentivize new Australians to have kids here and make it easier for them to raise kids in Australia. This could end up being a win-win for everyone involved.
Exactly. And I propose one more thing. So within the framework of this trust fund, the restrictions on how it's used would also basically mean that the property being bought in Australia has to, basically, you're getting a house in Australia. You can't use the money to buy a property overseas, obviously, and you also can't buy a property with help from overseas money. So I also want to short circuit the culture of foreign ownership coming in. I think foreign ownership of private property is ridiculous, but the government's not going to change it because it's the way it is, and people, it's part of the economy. So this entire trust fund thing would partially disincentivize that. I'm not sure exactly how, and maybe not fully, but I want this trust fund stuff to sort of encourage, Australian-born children to grow up here, invest money here, family home. I don't want this to be used for private property. I don't want the loans to be partially funded by this and then foreign money to be added. I think co-contributions to the trust fund deposit for a mortgage should be restricted to Australian property with Australian investment. So I kind of want to make sure that this is not going to be the trust fund isn't going to be a seed lump sum for coercion by young adults with foreign money, because the foreign investors might go, oh, hey, young person, we can leverage your 30 grand trust fund, get some property, and then we'll provide extra private equity. Do you want to, wouldn't you like to own investment property? I definitely want this to be partially blocked or disincentivized from the investment property thing, because that's another big problem.
All right, so it sounds like you're worried about foreign investors trying to take advantage of the system. That's definitely something to consider. One way to get around that might be to restrict the money to only being used for a person's own home, not an investment property. That way, the money goes directly towards helping young Aussies get on the property ladder.
Perfect. That's perfect. So if it's going to be used for property, I mean, look, there's always going to be loopholes, but once that money is released under the blockchain conditions, then I don't think I think there should also be limited review. So once the money is released under the blockchain, unless there's a serious error, unless there's a serious error or like immediate exploitation, red flag by some other part of the government, quite extreme, then there should be blocks on interfering. So once that money is released, the blockchain system shouldn't be questioned immediately. So what I can see is lawyers going, okay, we can't touch the blockchain, but as soon as the money is released, we can say the blockchain made a mistake by engineering a situation where somebody misuses the money. So you want to make sure that the blockchain decision is kind of final and arbitrated, like a legal entity, once it meets the conditions. And after that, it's harder to kind of, so put some kind of future liability on the questions of the blockchain getting it wrong, because if lawyers can't touch the blockchain easily, they're going to swarm around questioning whether the blockchain got it right, because lawyers are like vultures and they will try to fuck with this any way they can.
That's a very good point. You don't want a situation where the system gets tied up in endless legal battles. It would be better to have a clear appeals process built into the system. That way, if someone genuinely believes the blockchain made a mistake, they can challenge the decision, but it wouldn't hold everything up.
Well, basically, the blockchain if the blockchain releases the money with no external review, as in within the guidelines, then that should be fairly immune from further questioning, regardless of whether the person uses the money badly. But if the blockchain flags a review and then there's exemption circumstances and they get it wrong, then of course regular liabilities would. So once an exemption is made, then it's out of the blockchain system, but you want to discourage that as much as possible. But I also want to provide flexibility. But the thing is, there should be a cooling off period. So once the blockchain money is released, there should be, a period of maybe 20 years where no close relative can get involved in the equity of a house. So, if you get a deposit on a house and you start a mortgage, the way it is now, you can, after a little while, you can start dipping into the equity. So you want to block for, a period of maybe some cooling off period where the blockchain conditions still apply. So close relatives can't mess with it, because that just to keep that conflict of interest, and after a certain, maybe another 10 years, it's kind of assumed that, you figured your stuff out with your parents or whatever. But once that's immediately released, you want to also prevent opportunistics coming in, and you want that blockchain decision to be within the boundaries of the rules, to be fairly immune from being questioned too. You want to put a little bit of immunity there. So just a cooling off period, which I think it already exists, but you want this to specifically block close relatives trying to mess with the money, coercion, anybody who's trying to leverage that money, taking advantage of the person. Because the problem with this system is that lump sum coming into access is going to be extremely tempting, and all sorts of financial instruments and predatory lending will try to leverage that. So that it's important to really thoroughly block all obvious avenues to that. Basically make it a little nugget of money that can only be used for personal stuff, and block co-investment for a while. The only exception might be people using the trust fund thing to start a business might be able to start a business together, as long as it's all the same trust fund money. But close relatives should be blocked for leading up to it and a cooling off period, because that's the most obvious scam. But families are pretty awful with money, especially when if you grow up with a dysfunctional parent and you're about to inherit 50 grand, and that parent's a drug addict, and they're going to do everything they can to manipulate you to get that money, because this is the idea of breaking into generational trauma. This is the social side of my policy, which will annoy right-wingers and libertarians, but I want to combine the two. So
You're right, it's definitely about striking a balance between giving young people the freedom to make their own choices, but also protecting them from those who might take advantage of the system. In that case, it might be a good idea to create different categories of spending. Like maybe you could have a safe to spend category that's super easy to access, and then a separate category for bigger purchases like a house deposit that have stricter rules.
Well, yeah, I think that the creative ways to access the money that aren't like for a deposit or a lump sum would be, for example, let's say you wanted to go into a mature age apprenticeship, and you wanted to like start a trade. Is that the money could be used over 4 years or whatever for the apprenticeship to supplement the income, because an apprenticeship's low, so that you can have more financial freedom, and it can also pay for things you need like tickets and qualifications along the way, and kind of kickstart when you're qualified, to get further stuff. That's one way it could be, and then that's kind of better because if you start accessing the money at 30 in kind of a superannuation way with like an income, that's also that should be encouraged. If it's not going to be used as a house deposit, then it should be encouraged as some kind of supplementary income, whether that's for study or an apprenticeship, or some kind of thing like that. Maybe even non-profit things. If you want to go and do something good and you can get extra funding through charity, and you need to pay your own way, then you could pay yourself a salary if you want to do that. But cashing out a lump sum that's liquid cash that can be used and and abused or diverted, that should be discouraged as much as possible. And I think that's pretty easy to do. There's a lot of ways to start. So basically, this is like a pre-superannuation trust fund. Like if it's not going to be used as a lump sum to buy a house, then it could be used in some kind of supplementary income way, or to pay off. There's ways to do it, but you want to avoid turning that lump sum into liquid money and then having all the predatory actions, because you want to discourage the private lending field from being tempted to automatically commandeer and leverage that money, assuming they can get hold of it one way or another. If you discourage it enough, they'll just give up.
All right, so we need a system where the money is safe from people trying to take advantage of the kids. That means making it really difficult for anyone else to get their hand.
Well,
all right, let's explore some options.
That's what I was
all right,
proposed.
So here's another option to think about. Instead of the kids getting regular payments, they could use the trust fund as collateral for a special kind of loan. The loan would have really low interest, or maybe even no interest at all, and they could use the money for things like a house deposit or starting a business. That way, the money is there to help them when they need it, but it also means the actual lump sum stays invested and keeps growing.
Oh, I didn't think of that. How does that work?
All right, so here's how it could work. Imagine the trust fund is like a piggy bank that's steadily growing. Instead of breaking the piggy bank to get the cash, the kids could get a loan that uses the money inside as a kind of guarantee. This way, they get access to the money they need, but the trust fund itself isn't touched. It keeps on growing for the future. It's kind of like using your home as security to get a mortgage, but with a trust fund instead.
Well, yeah, that was kind of the assumption, was that if you wanted a business loan, you would get the loan some kind of like the assumption was that the trust fund is earning enough steady income in the superannuation that it could probably pay off a loan. So it would be your choice there. You might want to just buy the asset outright. I reckon that I like the libertarian idea of choice there. If it's an asset that's like functional to work, like I don't know, a delivery van, or building a shed, or incorporating a company, or buying a bunch of merchandise for from China, fine. But if somebody wants to leverage that money further for a low interest loan, to effectively have more money, then sure, yeah. But some people might not want to do that. Some people might just want to take that money, buy a car, without worrying about loans, because there's a lot of financially disadvantaged people that just aren't financially literate enough to know how to manage even a low interest loan. They wouldn't know how to do it. It would be like, they just...
You're right, we need to think about how the system would work for people who aren't financially savvy. It wouldn't be much help if they ended up getting into trouble because of a loan they didn't understand. Maybe the system could have a few different tracks that people could choose from. There could be a really simple track where the money is used to make regular payments, and a more complex track with loans and investments for people who understand that sort of stuff.
Well, I figure that when the money is released, part of the blockchain conditions of what you can do with it one of them could be, say, a basic credit check. So you turn 30 and the blockchain asks you to volunteer a credit check. And if you do, then the private equity credit market decides how much money they're willing to loan you. And then the blockchain would trust that as being, the market's decision of how how much credit you can get, and then whatever leveraged loan that they offer you at a low interest rate, with paid off by the initial lump sums. Initial lump sums are 8% per annum. Then that would be decided based on your credit history. So if you turn 30 and you've got like no credit history or bad credit history, then maybe the blockchain would say, okay, you can use it to buy a car, but we're not going to give you much of a loan to start a business, to leverage that money further. But if you have a stellar credit history at 30 and you're killing it, then the blockchain should say, okay, cool, well, we'll offer you that. So maybe have a credit check as part of it to decide whether you can get a low interest and leverage that money further. But I don't think it should be given out automatically, because you don't want to give somebody a lump sum, get them over their head with debt, and then the problem with that is credit agencies will prey on these people getting this money, especially the vulnerable. They will get them into loans, and then they'll hope that they default so that they can get the money back one way or another. So basically there should be a credit check in the blockchain. I know this is all very over nanny state and it goes against libertarianism, but the whole idea of this is to give kids a start, level the playing field. Also, the means testing shouldn't be so harsh that wealthy people are excluded. That's what the left seem comfortable with. The right wing aren't, obviously. And I think socially, it's great for a group of peers in society from whatever backgrounds to all be about to access a similar amount of money with similar conditions, because then it forces them to collaborate. And sure, if you're doing really well and you've proven that you've got credit check, you might be able to leverage more money than some people, but that lump sum should still be there. Even if you've got no credit history, you should still be able to use it to buy a $10,000 van, pay off $10,000 and whatever, do some renovations, whatever.
All right, so we're talking about how a trust fund could give kids a big advantage when they become adults. It could help them buy a house, start a business, or even just give them some breathing room to figure out what they want to do with their lives. You mentioned you wanted to make it fairer for kids from wealthier families. Have you thought about how the amount the government contributes could be based on a family's income? Like, families earning less would get bigger contributions.
Yeah, no, I already worked that out. So you want the total contributions to be even amongst all kids, and unfortunately that means setting it to the most the government can really afford in terms of like complete welfare dependency. So I worked out that $5,000 seed money the government coughs up for every kid, regardless of anything. Then the contributions, the total would be $20 a fortnight, and where that comes from would depend on the parent's employment status. The employer would want to contribute like superannuation, maybe part. So wealthy people would be expected to pay into the system from being employed, but you'd want it to come in directly from the employer, like compulsory superannuation. That way it's a little more fair for the aspirational. But you don't want a situation where wealthy parents can contribute more, and over 30 years some kids, the wealthy kids, end up with $400,000 instead of, because that creates future inequity. That defeats the whole purpose. So you want it to be annoyingly level for everybody, so that all the future kids at least have that amount in common, because that's kind of like a level playing field reboot at 30, and that means you've got time to separate from your family, decide what you want to do, learn how to be independent, and then everybody at the same age and same group and with equal peers get the same amount regardless of their means. So it's kind of like a reboot at 30. And you want that reboot to be as equitable across all fields. So you don't want the lump sum to vary between wealthy and rich. But once they get the lump sum, if they're ahead of the game and they're already responsible with money, there should be conditions that allow them to do more with it in terms of loans. If they're proven to be very incompetent, or they're incarcerated in a mental health asylum, maybe there'll be a delay on releasing it at all. But all those extreme exemptions would be flagged by the blockchain. So as soon as the blockchain, and the default would be it would go straight into super with nothing happening at all. So you want the blockchain to do most of the work. You don't want exceptions to be the rule.
So it sounds like you're worried about the system being abused. You want to make sure the money's protected, especially for young people who might not be able to handle a lot of responsibility. The blockchain could definitely help with that. It could be programmed to keep track of a person's circumstances and release the money at the right time.
Yeah, there could be conditions that delay it, and then certain conditions met that mean you can access it earlier. But like I said, like the blockchain is sophisticated enough to have these flexibilities, and that's what makes this idea in the modern world more appealing to me. Because the problem with, like, if you did this exact concept 20 years ago, without blockchain and all that, then it would either have to be just for a house loan, or like one of two things, and then you'd have like a bureaucratic system, administering it. You'd have to, it'd be insane, And the problem with that is that there'd be a whole, like, there'd be people trying to petition early. There'd be family trying to try to say the kids, not like, families already going to do that. Family want that money because they're drug addicts and whatever, and their kids about to get 30-year-old kids about to get 50 grand. They just want to get it. They're going to use every manipulation tactic under the sun. And without the blockchain deciding this shit, and you got the legal system, then it's all subjective. Then lawyers get involved and bureaucracy, and parents could easily just lie about the kid. Parents could say that the kid's a drug addict, the kid's pedophile, whatever, to try to make it seem like they shouldn't have the money. People can get really vicious, so you want that to be protected, because the biggest danger, I think, for disadvantaged kids is their parents trying to get the money. Because this is the whole idea of this is very social engineering-ish. This is very left wing, but this is why it appeals to left wing, because this is trying to break intergenerational poverty. This is a big ticket item. The left pretends that this is their priority, and they pretend they have the tools to manage it, and they do better than the right wing. But my proposal is using a mixture of both and making the arbitration up to a blockchain and putting protections built in. The whole idea of the 10-year gap is to give that young adult time to grow independent, learn how to, stand up to their parents. And so just put a lot of protections in there, especially from family, and don't leave it up to lawyers. Leave the blockchain should make the decision, and exceptions to the blockchain should be for genuine exceptions.
That makes a lot of sense. A contract with the government would really set expectations early on, and using the blockchain would make the system much more secure.
Well, yeah. I mean, the problem is once you open the door to social workers and bureaucrats and administrators and lawyers, you're going to have to listen to both sides. At the very least, it will delay release of the money for years with appeals. And the thing is, that's going to have to be paid from somewhere. If paying for all that bullshit doesn't come from the trust fund directly, then it's going to come from the government indirectly, and that again defeats the purpose, because legal fees in the public system, like a welfare dependent mum with a drug habit trying to get this money off a welfare dependent kid trying to break free, they could easily both have public lawyers and wrangle this out with social workers and end up costing the government more than the actual trust fund is worth. And nobody wins, and delay it for years. So you want to avoid all of that. You want a lot of rules and protections. You want the blockchain to make the decision most of the time. And when that blockchain is broken, then the automatic assumption is somebody's trying to get to the money. So the legal setup then to make decisions would be a bit adversarial. Like, why is the blockchain broken? What's the exemption for? With the assumption that it's probably nefarious. That's the approach I want. I want it to be fairly. I want a lot of dissenters there to do that.
That's a really interesting idea. Using the blockchain to make most of the decisions would mean there's a lot less room for outside influence or people trying to game the system. Would it be a good idea to set up a special task force for situations where the blockchain flags something as suspicious? They could investigate and make a recommendation to a judge. This would only happen in very specific cases.
Exactly. No, that's exactly how it would go. So there would be cases of breaking the rules of the blockchain that the child adult himself would only have to provide more information. So if they wanted it earlier, they would need to add additional information to the blockchain, open up a new set of conditions, say, okay, you're 21, you want it now. So prove that you're ready to have it. So, that would involve a credit check to find out how much they can borrow. Maybe they're self-employed with an ABN. Maybe they can prove, that they've been making profitable money and managing their business for a few years. if they're met, then they can access it early without any interference. So the only time it would be require external arbitration would be for those serious exemptions. Like maybe the parent is saying, yeah, the kid really is crazy, and they've got to, they whatever, or maybe there's a worry that through all these protections, there's still somebody trying to get around it. The problem with this is big engineering, social engineering stuff. Is once you put this in place with a 30-year time frame, you have to think big picture. There's going to be unforeseen consequences, and this might end up being a case of you don't want this to degenerate into what happens now with inheritance, because inheritance are the biggest squabbles with family, and it's ugly as hell. So you want to.
You're absolutely right. We need to think about the potential downsides of a system like this, especially when it comes to the long-term consequences. There's always the possibility of unintended consequences. One way to minimize the risk would be to regularly review and update the system, just to make sure it's still on the right track. It might be a good idea to set up an independent commission to do this.
I would say yes, but the problem is you want that blockchain to not be able to be broken, even for reasons of tinkering. You want to block that as well. You might have provisions in the blockchain to allow fine tuning, but the thing is, even though there might be unforeseen consequences, and this is a huge 30-year multi-generational thing, this is the kind of social engineering shit that libertarians hate, which is why my policy idea is social libertarian. It's like a contradiction in terms. But the thing is, the alternative is way worse. Like housing in Australia is affordability is going through the roof. It's not getting better anytime soon. And there's an entire generation locked out of the basic dignity of owning their own home. This is desperate times call for desperate measures, this kind of policy. And if it proves to work well in 30 years, then keep going. If it proves just to provide one generation the ability to get a house, but it has unforeseen consequences, then review it. Maybe let it go for 30 years. Yeah, maybe let it go for 10 years with a 30-year gap. So that's a 50-year total. So 10 generations of kids over 10 years, then stop and then wait to see what happens. Because if you keep going with 30 years of delay, even if you stop it, the machine has to keep going for another 30 years. That's the problem with this. Once you start going, you're in for 30 years for every year that happens, every generation, you don't want to start it going and then, give it to 10 years worth of kids and then take it away from a future generation. But I don't think that this can't be nutted out, This is a big ticket policy idea. It's bipartisan enough that you'd like, both sides of government to go, housing affordability is crap. We need to fix it. Let's think outside the box. That's what I'm aiming for. This is pie in the sky shit. I'm completely deluded. This is never going to happen. But it's good to daydream, because these kind of ideas, once you talk about them, at least policymakers start thinking in those terms.
You're right, it's definitely a big idea, and it would take a lot to get something like this off the ground. But it's worth putting the idea out there and seeing what happens. Maybe a good way to start is by contacting your local member of parliament. They might be interested in hearing about the idea, and it could be a good way to get some feedback on whether it's even feasible.
I definitely will. I think the answer would be with this, which I don't agree with, is to go halfway. But the thing is, a house deposit is always going to be way out of reach, and it's ridiculous now to have the cost of a mortgage. First of all, the length of a mortgage now is 30, 40 years with two incomes. But if you're asking young people to turn 18, figure out how to manage their money, get employed, save up for 10 years before they start a loan, or longer to get the deposit, that's ridiculous. And there are already policy ideas to try to get this deposit from superannuation, but that's fucking lazy. Maybe short term, because 30 years, but down the track, I think that access to super now should be used for deposits for the current generation. But if we start implementing this now, in 30 years' time, there'll be because this isn't going to get better anytime soon. And the thing is, this kind of policy idea encourages, the birth rate to go up a bit. It takes a bit of the burden off. It takes a bit of the burden off parents affording to have a kid in general, because if a double income parent have one kid now or two kids, and they're trying to save for a deposit, and they're going to have a 40-year mortgage, well then, the having one kid is hard enough. Having two is difficult, and three is out of the question. And we need two minimum for a stable birth fucking rate. Otherwise, we're going to need ever more immigration. And this is common across the world. So you want the burden of the parents at 30 to be offset by this nest egg, because most adults are dependent past 30. I am myself. On my parents a little bit and the government. It's embarrassing, but I'm not the only one. And so the financial burden of parents doesn't end when kids go out for a lot of people. And a lot of young adults spend 10 years of their prime just trying to save for a deposit, and then they're in for another 30 years of mortgage. So either way, if there's a generation in the future that has access to this nest egg to take the burden off the parents, supporting them if they're not making it and whatever, then that helps everybody, and that encourages people to have more kids. And we need to get the birth rate up to 2 in, 2 out for stability. Otherwise, the species is in terminal decline.
You're right, it's definitely a problem that young people are spending so many years just trying to save for a deposit. That's a lot of time that could be spent focusing on building a career or starting a family. This trust fund could give them the financial stability they need to move on to the next stage of their lives. Do you think it would be more beneficial for kids to get the money in a lump sum when they turn 30? Or would it be better to release the money gradually over a few years?
Lump sum for a house deposit's fine. We've already been through this. We're going in circles. Your memory is obviously limited. No, we've covered this. But yeah, just the reasons for this being a good idea, even though risky, I think is multifaceted. Because let's say a couple now. Let's say somebody, young adults now, want to have, say, 2 or 3 kids, but the idea of it is financially daunting. If this policy was implemented tomorrow, then in 30 years' time, those people are going to have let's say they do have 2 to 3 kids. Then if both of those kids within a few years are going to have access to this nest egg, right at the time at which, they're getting to retirement age, and the kids don't want to be a financial, that's what's happening now, then that takes a lot of pressure off those now heading for retirement adults who have put in the hard work. And it'll encourage the future generation to maybe have 2 kids by default instead of 1. And we need to get to 2 kids being affordable for the middle class, and we need to do it quickly. Otherwise, the entire species is in serious trouble. The only way to solve the population crash coming in the next few years is to have a whole lot of these policy ideas. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble.
You're right. A declining birth rate is a serious issue, but it's a complex problem with a lot of contributing factors. It would take a whole range of changes to address the root causes and encourage people to have bigger families. Would you like to talk about some other policies that could help improve the situation, in addition to this trust fund idea?
No, I just feel that if this policy is implemented, there'll be some kids who need that trust fund freedom to get away from neglectful, abusive parents and break the poverty cycle. Then you're going to have kids who need it just to for that period of time to figure out what they want to do and how to manage money. And then there's other people who have got good parents and close parents who they're still dependent on just because they don't have the skills or whatever, and that would provide a short circuit, because 30 is about the time where a bit of a break can pay off debts that you've or whatever, and you can use it, and that gives a little signal break, whether it's for a house deposit for the next generation, and that takes the burden off the previous generation raising kids. And because financial dependency now is well into 30 for a lot of people, because the younger generation need to save for that deposit. So it's a catch-22, and the majority of this trust fund will probably be used in the majority by masses, on averages by people just to get that house deposit. That'll be the big ticket. But you want flexibility in there for all people from all life, because some people are well off that they can already afford a house deposit. They should still get this same trust fund, because I think it should be equal across. So the idea is you means test to get the contributions from the parents, so that the end result is that every kid has a nest egg, and then it's like resetting. Then from then on, what you do with the money on, might create divisions again. So it's like,
You're right, this trust fund would benefit kids from all backgrounds. Even if some families are already doing well financially, the extra money could be used for other important things, like education or starting a business. In that case, it would make sense to have a system that allows people to contribute extra money to their child's trust fund, if they wanted to. That way, it would be completely optional. It's a bit like private health insurance. People can choose whether or not they want the extra coverage, but it's available for those who want it.
exactly. The other thing is,
Okay, so it sounds like you have a good handle.
the other thing is,
What's on your mind?
well, I was thinking for people,
All right.
with like managed mental health disability issues that affect their finances, like myself. If I had that trust fund, right, and because I don't really think would want to buy a house with it, what I would want it for is, as you suggested, is the trust fund sitting there still in the superannuation system, earning 8.5% a year. So therefore, in a given year, when I need lump sum payments that I'm poor at planning, like car repairs or whatever, or new tires or $1,000 of repairs, is I could access that money as an afterpay system and have it paid off through the dividends from the lump sum without affecting it. So if I need $1,000, that can be made available at very low interest and paid off on equal payments from the trust fund, the extra trust fund money from the 8% of the investment, the profit every year, over a year. So if $1,000 come up, I don't need to go through afterpay, potentially risk messing that up, have direct debits, mess up my finances. It's the money's brought up from my trust fund. In the case of like ongoing poorly managed mental health conditions that affect finances like me, that would be really beneficial, because then it'd be like, cool, well, I can go out and take some risks, get a car, and when it needs to be fixed, I don't have to freak out about where the money's going to come from and then worry about messing up repaying it. Because for some people, basic financial competency is limited by disability and medication, which is kind of embarrassing.
That's a very important point. A financial advisor would be able to help you create a system that works with your individual circumstances. They could figure out the best way to make sure you can access the money you need, while still keeping your long-term financial goals in mind.
Well, this kind of already happens with Afterpay. So Afterpay in Australia and around the world, I'm assuming, is like, it's not full-blown credit. And the interest is kind of absorbed, I guess, somewhere along the way. But, basically it's, you buy something, you pay a quarter of the amount, and then you pay the rest of the quarterly installments over the next fortnight. And it's designed to match, wages, like, and that should be easy to manage, and it is, until, you get $1,000 of car repairs, and you've got to pay rego, then you're worried because those direct debits you have to match, if your wage is really low. So if those things, the same system and legal framework that allows Afterpay to be halfway to full-blown credit, because it's not full-blown. It's not. The regulations aren't the same for full-blown credit. You don't have the same freedom, but you could incorporate this lump sums growth and profit yearly to pay off these kind of things. Because the thing is, the superannuation system is still outpacing interest in a bank. Nobody who's struggling financially has enough money in the bank to theoretically get 3% interest. And the banks, banks from the idea. So superannuation is way ahead of inflation, and there's enough with a lump sum of 50 grand. In fact, I think superannuation should be accessible in that way now. I don't know how much super I've got in there, but it's enough that it would be earning a certain amount a year. And if I needed a loan, if I needed financial support, something like that, and I didn't have the means for credit, then I reckon that should be leveraged even now.
You're right, having access to some of your superannuation earlier could provide a huge safety net. And because superannuation funds are professionally managed, you'd know the money would be growing at a good rate. That would make it much easier to get back on your feet after a setback.
Exactly. I mean, the thing is, superannuation.
What's on your mind?
No, that's it. Bye.